God bless in the wonderful name of Jesus Christ. Welcome to this wonderful occasion of Remnant Adventures in the Word. The Toledo Bible Gardens on the air, live and somewhat colorful. This is Craig Martindale on the 29th of September, 2019. And once again, we are set, purposed for the defense of the gospel, as the great Apostle Paul stated in Philippians 1:17. Going through some files this past week, I came upon a stack of papers. It was under a heading called 2 Timothy. And I go, well, what is this? To myself. And I pull it out, and there's 120 pages of handwritten work on 2 Timothy, and it looks like my handwriting. I said, what the heck is this? Where's this been? And, of course, over these last few days, I've gradually remembered now how I hand wrote this appraisal of the 4 steps downward on the encouragement of our wonderful brother who awaits the return, Brian Barton. Brian and Deb and Brendan and I went to West Virginia for a few days at a timeshare, and Deanne drove up and joined us for some fellowship. And one of the things I had brought along, and this was in December of 2014, was, as I recall, 7 or 8 pages I had started to write on the 4 steps downward of 2 Timothy. It's right in front of me here. And I had Brian read it and asked him what he thought of it, and he just shook his head and said, this is amazing. You got to keep going. So really, it's interesting. I wasn't sure if this was worth the time at the time, based on where we were in our lives and what we were studying together and working on. And that's way before we had done any kind of telephone teaching hookups like we do, internet hookups. So I went on, and over it took me a few months. Matter of fact, it might have taken on and off throughout. No, let's see. I mailed it out to the Remnant. I have a cover letter here where I mailed it out at the end of February 2015. So there you go. It took around 3 months to handwrite, for the most part, on this 11.5 by 14 legal size, front and back, a 100-page study of the 4 steps downward. And I'd certainly like to make this available to you. Some of you like to get things through email where you can then print it off yourself. Some would rather like a hard copy. We'll do our best to arrange. Some of you that have been with us in these studies since 2015 might check your files and remind yourself that is sitting there. I had forgotten all about this, and yet as I reviewed it this week, I was pleasantly amazed and blessed to see that, for the most part, the things I hand wrote on the perspective of these 4 steps downward, I have indeed taught over these weeks. As we come to the concluding chapter of 2 Timothy, I think I'll work from these sheets. So now that they're here, I said to Bruce and Valerie on the phone this morning that it's like finding money. We that love the Word, who rejoice in the Word as one who findeth great spoil, in other words, caches of riches and treasures that we didn't know we had access to, it was like finding money. It really is, even if I do say so myself, a beautiful and brilliant piece of work. And for the most part, you can even read my handwriting. How do you like that, Bible fans? I started this paper, and I thought I'd just read the first page or so, and then I'll work from it this morning. And this is dated 12/18/14. Years ago, Dr. Victor Paul Wierwille, in the mid-1970s, taught from 2 Timothy the 4 downward steps in the degradation and ruin of the church, the assembly, the ecclesia. 1 Timothy sets the reign of the church, while 2 Timothy speaks to its ruin. In each revelation, the appointed and called ministers of the gospel of the glory of God are exhorted to stand and withstand their spiritual enemy, not being ignorant of his devices. For as the great apostle stated in Philippians 4:12 and 13, we are to know how to stand, whether the circumstances abound or are abased. We are to continue to do all things through Christ, which strengthens us. While 1 Timothy directs the minister to his responsibilities while the assembly prevails in the word, 2 Timothy directs the minister's responsible behaviors as the ecclesia is pulled down or pulverized. The 4 scriptures that we will examine in biblical and spiritual detail: 2 Timothy 1:15, this thou knowest, that all they which are in Asia be turned away from me, of whom are Phygelus and Hermogenes. Number 2, 2 Timothy 2:17 and 18. And their word will eat as doth a canker, of whom is Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the truth have erred, saying that the resurrection, and I had put in parentheses even then, power, resurrection power, is past already, and overthrow the faith or believing of some. Number 3, 2 Timothy 3:8 and 9. Now as Jannes and Jambres withstood Moses, so do these also resist the truth, men of corrupt minds, reprobate concerning the faith. But they shall proceed no further, for their folly shall be manifest unto all men, as theirs also was. 2 Timothy 4:3 and 4. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. I go on to write the number 4 symbolizes God's creative works on earth, so that not only delineations are unveiled regarding God's direct works of righteousness, but also, as in the case of these 4 summarizing sections of Scripture, his defining perspectives regarding the adversary's devices to infiltrate and deteriorate unto ruin the church of the body of Christ. These revelations discern, distinguish, delineate the false spirits of satanic source who assaulted continually the first century church to make it shipwrecked and bring it to devastation, thus setting vividly the admonitions to the faithful minister in detail to continue to heed his or her calling in the midst of such loss. Remember, every believer has a ministry to perform, as Dr. Wierwille unveiled in Receiving the Holy Spirit Today, the great book. I believe that's in his section where he is handling 1 Corinthians 12:28 to 30. that wonderful line, every member has a ministry to perform. It may or may not be what Ephesians calls a gift ministry, the ruling ministries of apostle and prophet and evangelist and pastor and teacher. But within every one of us, each one of us, as we make this word our own, as we think it through, consider it deeply, and as we faithfully apply the living word in our minds and decisions through our days, what emerges is long suits in particular manifestations of power from on high. What Dr. Earl would say, duck soup, he'd call it. It's duck soup. Easy as falling off a greased log backwards, he'd say. In other words, it comes easily to you as you allow this word to dwell richly within. So that's why I believe this 2 Timothy presentation and revelation is certainly applicable in these times of apostasy and derangement. And as I said here in the paper, shipwreck, quoting from 1 Timothy chapter 1, of those that were endeavoring to make the church, the assembly, shipwreck. And I remember when Dr. Wierwille taught that concept of shipwreck back in 1974 and 75, 73 and 74 actually it was, where he said, you see, it's a shipwreck. There's just debris floating in the waters. And so each has to grab a piece of debris to survive. And it was months ago, as I was preparing my mind in these 2 Timothy teachings, working it in confluence with our unveiling of the concept of the remnant, that I got to thinking about how each of us, beyond a piece of shipwrecked debris, have actually built ourselves into solid ground so that we are each an island in the midst of the vast oceans of doubt. So you see, tied together his wonderful metaphors for power for abundant living. And then it's interesting, this was 9 or 10 years ago, I came across a novel called The Island of the Day Before. Sort of a fantasy, fictional novel that had a lot of interesting concepts in it, beautifully written by a guy named Umberto Eco, E-C-O, an Italian linguist and philologist, brilliant man. Some of you might recall the movie from years ago with Sean Connery called The Name of the Rose, set in medieval Europe around murders at a monastery. Well, that was based on a novel by Umberto Eco. After I saw the film, I was impressed by the display of these horribly demeaned and distorted monks that all lived together in this ugly place. And yet it also had a theme of scholarship in it and the precious nature of books. So I got the novel and read it, and then I reread it again about a year ago. It's just so brilliantly written. Great detail, great medieval history. You know, a lot of good things and horrible things you read, but it was so well written, I appreciated it. Well, anyway, he later wrote a book called The Island of the Day Before, which was based on the idea that a young man who had indentured himself to serve as a sailor on a ship of exploration out of Portugal, a fully equipped ship, woke up one morning and he was the only one on the ship. He didn't have any idea where everyone had gone, but everything was intact. He had all the food, all the water, all the equipment, all the materials. And so it was an interesting concept. He was a fully rigged, fully equipped, solitary person. Of course, you can see the analogy as I was thinking of years of exile and the remnant concept and all of this. He had everything he needed to live. And then the story goes on to unveil a number of aspects of his getting along and trying to figure out what happened. But the things I most appreciated was the detailing of the equipment, all the casks of water, the barrels of salt pork, the fruit and vegetables stored that he could live with. He had all his body, soul needs supplied. He taught himself how to sail the ship. He was just a cabin mate, young man, didn't really know all the particulars of the riggings and the sails and all of that and the winds, and he pretty much, by practical application of what he had available in his knowledge, learned how to navigate and make this ship move. I thought a lot of that with the Word too. When we end up on our own and have no more access to perhaps the resources and brains that we enjoyed previously, we have to learn for ourselves how to do things in the Word. And that can be done because we all have capabilities and abilities unique to ourselves. And yet all of us can lament that, oh, I don't know this about that, I don't know that about this. And yet at some point you have to stop that and just decide to use what you have. To walk with the Father, to rightly divide His Word, to be skillful in the word of righteousness. This is 2 Timothy. These are days of estrangement, abandonment, betrayal, treason, apostasy. So we have to make up our minds to take what we do have access to, our own abilities, our own resources, and then stand and withstand and set ourselves, set our faces like a flint, like Isaiah says, for the defense of the gospel, the good news of the grace of God. So we are islands unto ourselves, in a sense, therefore leading to, years ago, I had read the great unveiling of the Russian slave system by Alexander Solzhenitsyn called the Gulag Archipelago or Archipelago. Archipelago is a reference to a section of ocean or the sea that has multiple islands spread out within it. In other words, there's a loose unity to it, and yet each island is a government unto itself, a life unto itself, so to speak. So he chose it metaphorically to describe the prison system of under Joseph Stalin, in which millions and millions of Russian people were unfairly tortured and sent to their deaths. Some survived and lived to write about it. Solzhenitsyn was one of the few that first came out and let the Western world know what was going on right under our noses. Even let the Russian people know what was going on right in their own backyards. With the great book, The Gulag. Gulag is a transliteration of a Russian word meaning prison. The Gulag Archipelago. So all these factors moving in my thoughts, coming to confluence, I felt it was an appropriate metaphor, hypokatastasis, even allegory, to describe our lives today as the remnant of the archipelago. That we are complete in Him, each individual. And of course, you that stand with spouses and children and friends in close proximity even adds to your resources. And yet still, when it gets down to it, we are each individuals, fully equipped, like that ship that young man woke up to find himself abandoned to, and yet fully equipped to meet his need, to explore and discover what he could make the most of with his capabilities and abilities. We are all spiritually completely complete. The Aramaic goes to 4 levels of intensity in Colossians 2, 9, and 10. So we are 4 levels of intensity capable to stand even in a time in which the 4 steps downward have been realized. So we work this word with the resources we have. You know, you pick up things. One of the things I've enjoyed about those Jason Bourne films that they've done, I think 4 of them over the years. I actually read Robert Ludlum's Bourne, Bourne, novels back in the 70s and 80s when they were published. Enjoyed them very much, and it was, again, which is many times the theme in some of these adventure books, is the theme of one man, one woman standing against all the evil around them, and how resourceful and diligent they had to be. And one of the things I appreciate about a couple of the scenes in these Bourne films, played by that actor Matt Damon, is some of the fight scenes. And they're so incredibly choreographed. And what impresses me so often in these skirmishes that he gets in is how he uses whatever's available to him in the situation. The scene I remember most vividly is where he's being chased by this Middle Eastern assassin, very capable assassin. And he's jumping through these old rickety buildings and busting in and out of these old homes and apartments crammed on top of each other, and he gets cornered into this little dinky apartment in this Arab city. And here comes the guy at him. And how I've watched it 7 or 8 times. It must have taken him days to film it. But not only does he use his physical body, he didn't have any weapons on him, but he obviously used his fists and his elbows and his forearms and his shoulders and his knees and his feet. But one of the great scenes to me is he grabs a phone book and uses this big, thick phone book to wrap this guy across the face several times, and then he puts the phone book up against the guy's face, and apparently there must be a physics thing involved in this. He punches the book into his face, which must increase the impact from some point of view. I just loved it. And I'm watching that, and I'm going, look, he's using the resources available to him. He's not saying, time out, I don't even have a gun. I don't even have a knife. No, you can't do that. You can't do it in a fight with the prince of the power of the air. You can't sit at some point, you have to quit complaining about what you don't know and start working with what you do know. And from there, building up your resources and building up the walls of fire spiritually about you, and building up the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night that will comfort and protect you, instead of kicking and screaming, which we've all gone through, I did too, about what I no longer have available to me. So you rise up and claim what's yours. If you got to grab a phone book to beat the crap out of who's coming at you, grab the damn phone book. If you got to grab something else, throw it at them. We are athletes of the Spirit. At some point, which we all have reached, and I trust if you get tempted in this, you'll get over it more quickly now. At some point, you quit complaining about what you've lost, and you build on what you still have. and you fight like the dickens not to let the adversary steal any more of the truth or the resources of holiness from you. And this is 2 Timothy. This is our life. This is our life. This is the present truth. Now, in the paper, I then go immediately to different Bible versions of these 4 scriptures, which I have done, of course, to some degree over these weeks. And I learned this from Dr. Wierwille. He always would use whatever versions of the Word he could get his hands on to claim the benefits of the brains of previous men and women before him. And from there you have to delineate, you have to distinguish, discriminate, discern. And many times phrasings and terms come up that I wouldn't have thought of, and it adds detailed appreciation of that revelation. And then, of course, you come across mishandlings also, which keeps your mind sharp. But I'm not going to read any more of the first 3. We've done quite a lot of that, but I would like to now read from a few of these other renderings of 2 Timothy 4, verses 3 and 4, which is the 4th step downward. This is from the Amplified Bible, if you have your Amplified Bible at hand. If you have your Amplified Bible, I won't need to talk as loud, will I? Aha. Anyway. I said it was live and somewhat colorful, okay? 2 Timothy 4, 3 and 4. For the time is coming when people will not tolerate, endure sound and wholesome instruction. Now I'm going to stop and comment as I go through, as my manner is. They will not tolerate sound doctrine. Holy cow, what a great word. Sound doctrine becomes distasteful. Well, to Job, he eschewed evil. Evil was distasteful. But as people are manipulated and beguiled and conned and hustled through the first 3 downward steps by counterfeit leadership and their own weaknesses and slothfulness and susceptibilities and vulnerabilities to Satan's devices, you know they have gone the full 4 steps down into the ditch led by the blind when they no longer can tolerate the sound and wholesome good news of the grace of God. Well, as I think that through, that tells me they have become enamored with some legalism or legalistic tradition. And as we'll get to it in the verse, some myth and fable of the doctrines and commandments of men. Because when you boil it all down, you've only got 2 choices. Either go the gospel of the grace of God, the revelation of the great mysteries set forth in Paul's epistles, or you go the route of body-soul legalisms, touch not, taste not, handle not, which are all to perish with the using, the bewitching manipulations of the deceitful handling of the word of life, fomented, fostered by counterfeit, devil-infused ministers who portray themselves as righteous and yet are energized by devil spirits and not Holy Spirit. So there's only 2 choices. Are we going to go the way of the grace of God? As Paul said, by the grace of God I am what I am. I do not frustrate the grace of God, Paul claimed. Or are we going to be so soon removed as he confronted the Galatians? I marvel that you are so soon or quickly removed from my gospel to another, and then he quickly adds, which is not another. In other words, you can call it a good news, but it is not good news if it's counter to the revelation received of Paul set forth in the great 7 epistles, and then beyond in subsequent applications like in Timothy here. So the time is coming when they will not tolerate or endure sound and wholesome instruction. That's doctrine. And if you're off on how to believe rightly, then you're skewed and then skewered the rest of the way. You're pinned like a bug on a table to the legalism of the spirit realm, bewitched by false ministers. But having ears itching, reading again in Amplified, having ears itching for something pleasing and gratifying. Now stop there. Remember the Mars Hill gang? They spent their whole days in doing nothing but seeking some new thing. Look at the fine lines here. Yes, we enjoy discovery. We enjoy discovery of what you might term new things. But the authentic, godly richness of new things is, for the most part, discovering greater depth in things you have already known, things you have already been taught, and perhaps many things that you have forgotten. Yes, forgotten. That's the great joy of discovery, time after time, as we work this present truth in our remnant adventures in the Word. Yes, at times something perhaps brand new is energized to our attention by the Father's grace and mercy. But most of the things that I've had the privilege of discovering and teaching are greater depths into things you've already known, perhaps forgotten about, perhaps lost the freshness of your believing towards. And even the new things discovered, like some of these, what you might term new benefits of speaking in tongues that we have unveiled over these years, like renouncing hidden things of dishonesty in the old nature. Yes, you'd call it new, and yet it's certainly based upon all the previous knowledge that has been imparted to us. But on Mars Hill, it was just itchy ears. The attention of a water bug, I'd call it. Just flit, 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 flit. Years ago, one of the teachers used to say, like spit on a griddle, people's attention span, it dissipates. Have you noticed where everything popularized in this world is pretty much designated towards ruining staid mind concentration? Sure, because it's quicker to slip lies past you when the habits of the world creep into your mental habits. The whole penchant and push is to ruin the great richness of staying your mind and deep considerations and deep, in-depth investigative thought. Now, this can be done from extremes. The world either bores you so deeply that it becomes almost painful, or they throw so much at you in such fragmented, distracting ways that you don't have time to consider one point made until they jump to another one. you have to fight both aspects of it, from the old nature and from the senses realm. So when they do not tolerate or endure sound and wholesome instruction, somehow both extremes are involved. People become bored with the truth, and you have to lay blame not only on themselves, but on how their teachers have handled the word without verve, without charismatic energy, without true energizing, but have simply mouthed the truth, even though accurate on paper, quite mundane and becoming routine, provincial, pedestrian, so that people become bored with great biblical concepts. That's, of course, for the most part, you got to blame the ministers who have not themselves stayed energized, but have subjected themselves to the enslavement of spirits of slumber, spirits of stupor. They have gone soporific, and the truth has become just strings of solecisms and fable. So both aspects hit those that no longer endure sound and wholesome instruction. And yet, as boring as a teacher is, if you find that resolve in your own heart, and I believe many of you have done that, that's why you're with me in these days. In your own way, you have fought through that mishandling. Remember when Jesus taught the people in Israel, the Gospels specifically say that he taught them not as the Pharisees, for he taught them with boldness. So the droning, boring, soporific handling of the Old Testament by the Pharisees was superseded by the grand fire and enthusiasm and boldness, fearlessness of Jesus Christ. This you have to always keep alive in your mind, even when you're going over truths that you've reviewed thousands of times. Every time I read a scripture, which is every day, some part of the word that I've already been reading for years, I'm always pushing myself in a godly way, not an over whatever dramatized fear-based way, but in a godly way, pushing myself to see something deeper that fits for me at this time, right now, this day that I'm preparing to live. And this can happen all through a day. One example I think of a couple of weeks ago was out riding my two-wheeled sports car. It's convertible, called a bicycle. And at the time, I was preparing to teach you on the concept of mark and avoid from Romans 16:17, and I had studied that morning the word scopeo, the word for mark, and in reading the definition from Bullinger, his concordance, I was running this through my mind as I was off on a side street. I like to ride through the neighborhoods where the traffic's real thin, and I like to, wherever possible, up on sidewalks, so I'm not worried about the nutty drivers. But it gives me time to think. It's refreshing, very refreshing, especially when I've spent hours in the Word. It's very refreshing to take a breath and get out there and pedal my old two-wheeled sports car. But I was thinking through how this word scopeo, one of the defining attributes of it was that it means to see something from a distance, to see it far enough away that you can prepare to avoid it. So I just pulled out of where I'd gone into my local bank here, and I was coming down this side street. And us bike riders are always aware of the wild animals on the loose, especially dogs. And, of course, most of them are on leashes. But this one yappy, snappy little bird brain, waste of space barking thing, four-legged barking thing, would always bark at me behind a fence at this certain street. So I'd gotten where it didn't startle me anymore. But I looked down the street, maybe 100 yards, and this thing's out in the road. Same damn dog. Well, guess what I thought of? Scopeo. Father has allowed me to see it from a distance so I can avoid it. So there was a turnoff right there. As soon as I saw that little dumb yapping mongrel, I said, well, I ain't going that way. I don't need revelation for this. I got the word. I see it from a distance. Mark it, avoid it. See how it not only was practical in sort of a humorous way, but it was also reiterating the truth that I was thinking through. And of course, I remember vividly, well, they're thinking, well, there's Philippians 3:2, beware of the dogs. You know that's got to come up. So I turned down this side street I'm very familiar with, and I'm very aware there's a automotive garage right over here on my right side, or a locally owned place, and they've got their cars up on their lifts, and people are working in there. I had pedaled maybe 10 feet, and someone dropped. It sounded like a hubcap full of nuts and bolts. Sounded like a grenade going off. That chrome hubcap hitting that concrete floor in there. Wham! And I guarantee you, my first thought, and it did startle me, was be not afraid of sudden fear. Proverbs. You see how this is the word of life to us. And this is just the way we recognize truth through a day. And no sooner had I recognized that and was sort of chuckling to myself, I turned the corner. And of course, as us bike riders know, especially if you enjoy the local roads and the sidewalks, you've always got to be aware of driveways. People backing out of driveways, side streets, alleys. And I always give the right of way until I'm sure they see me and signal me to cross. And especially with all these tinted windshields, you can't even see the driver in some of these cars. So you always assume I have not been seen. And people are pretty courteous. For the most part, they'll wave me through, and I always thank them, you know. But I pull around the corner from the auto garage, so there I've been reminded of Scopeo, mark and avoid. I've been reminded of beware of the dogs. I've been reminded of be not afraid of sudden fear. And within 20 seconds, I turn the corner, there's a lady in a van pulling out one of these hidden driveways. And she wasn't going very fast, and I wasn't going that fast yet, but I knew I didn't have time to brake. I was going to bump into her. Now, it wouldn't have been a wreck, you know, but it would have been embarrassing. But I immediately looked to the right, and there's a pathway, a sideway around her. There it is, right there. And what did I think of immediately? 1 Corinthians 10:13. That he makes a way to escape that we may be able to bear it. So by then, I'm ready to pull over and take a breath. I say, okay, Lord, man, I love those lessons, but I got to take a breath here. And even then, as I chuckled to myself, I reviewed in my mind the incidents and the scriptures that came to my mind, because I knew I'd want to share this sometime. So there you go. But it's the word living within us, dwelling in us richly. When people get to the place where they're so bored with the truth, see what I mean? That they can no longer see any doctrinal or practical application of it. They are imprisoned, and you cannot let that happen to you. And that's vigilance and diligence and awareness, and every individual's walk is their own. All I can do as a teacher and your brother in the Lord is share the best I can with how I endeavor to love this word so deeply that it comes to my mind throughout a day, and that the awareness of it in practical life enriches the truth of it to me, and therefore enriches my fellowship with my Father, the Creator of the heavens and the earth, which is the whole point of having this word and having these manifestations. So when they get where they don't tolerate or endure sound and wholesome instruction, both extremes, you have to watch yourself. Boredom, mundane, going through the motions. No. You gotta slap yourself upside the head, so to speak, and wake yourself up. Many times the best way to do that is just speak in tongues. Fire it up. Don't they have a phrase in the world, being taken for granted? Yeah. What do you think? God likes being taken for granted? Are you grateful that your need is met today? Are you grateful for the comforts of your physical surroundings? Are you grateful for your physical and mental and emotional need being met, not to mention the spiritual? I don't think the Father likes being taken for granted, does he? He said to Israel, "You have forgotten me days without end." A nursing mother would sooner forget her child than you should forget me. An ox that needs to eat would forget where to get the feed before you should be forgetting me. In all our ways, acknowledge him. So you got to watch that part of it. And then, of course, the other side of it is you can get too whipped up about thinking you want to learn something brand new all the time, something you've never thought of before. Well, that can become an idolatrous mindset. See, it's always a blend here. You have to research. And I give you oodles of illustrations of that as I work this word through and share my heart with you and teach. This isn't the first time I've read this scripture, but see how we refresh it with perspective. And you yourself can refresh it with your own personal witness and in your own personal testimonial of how you have held fast to the truth despite these manipulations of Satan to try to get us where we no longer endure sound and wholesome instruction. And of course you get into the slothful category when you no longer endure. We are athletes. It requires endurance. And yet it's a joyful endurance. We all get hit with little irritations that would keep us from our chosen tasks in performing the works of Jesus Christ and greater. So you endure through it because your motivation supersedes the irritation. Well, let's move on. But having ears itching, what a great figure of speech. Of course, literally ears itching is one thing, and an itchy ear is certainly an irritation. They are irritated unless they have verification of their old nature impulses. But having ears itching, back to the Amplified. For something pleasing and gratifying, they will gather to themselves one teacher after another to a considerable number, chosen to satisfy their own liking and to foster the errors they hold. and will turn aside from hearing the truth and wander off into myths and man-made fictions. And in this paper I wrote that I had forgotten about, reviewing it this morning, I have a whole section on these teachers they heap to themselves. And there's one particular part I saw that I would like to share with you. While I'm looking for it, you should go to 1 Corinthians 11, because the phrase out of here is they will gather to themselves one teacher after another, to a considerable number, chosen to satisfy their own liking and to foster the errors they hold. You see, there's your slothfulness. They get confronted by a genuine, energized minister. They get confronted, but they don't like it. So they go find them another teacher who can verify their old nature habits and give them excuses for it, instead of renewing their mind up and beyond and obeying the true teacher of the Word. And after you've done that a few times, what happens? You no longer recognize an authentic teacher. 2 Corinthians 11. That's what I mean. Here, I finally found it. Look at verse 19. Paul confronts them. Reproof, for ye suffer fools gladly. And then I make the point, these are the false apostles of verse 13. Those that preach another Jesus of verse 4. For ye suffer fools gladly, seeing ye yourselves are wise. That phrase is the figure of speech irony. Now, if it was used in a devilish way, you'd call it sarcasm or cynicism. But in the Word, it's irony. Ye yourselves are wise, huh? It's a figure trying to wake them up. In other words, if you're so wise, why have you endured these fools so gladly? And you know what the gladness is in their enduring of false ministers? Well, for one thing, you keep going to their dumb meetings, keep playing their idiot tapes, keep reading their wrong dividing of the Word articles. Another thing is you financially support them. That's the real depth of this scripture. You suffer fools gladly. You know, people quote that phrase. They don't even know it's from the Word, do they? The great impact of enduring foolish teachers is that you have so become convinced of their authenticity that you support them financially. And whether you like to admit it or not, you can't go on what they say. You got to go on what the Word says. It's a love of money. I read you Micah last week, where they reach out with both hands to manipulate and take their bribes to do evil with both hands. It's the love of money, which means power and influence over you and over your mind. For ye, goes on to verse 20, for ye suffer, and then I write in my bracket here, the afflictions of false leadership, like the grievous wolves of Acts 20, and the false ministers of 2 Timothy. For you suffer or endure if a man, false leader, bring you into bondage. The Amplified reads, if a man assumes control of your souls and makes slaves of you. When they have so manipulated your attention that you faithfully give of your resources to them, that's this Amplified. If a man assumes control of your souls, your soul is under their control. The Spirit's in them. Now, if you give to an authentic minister by a free will choice, and God's working in you, His Word effectually working in you, that's different. And you can expect great reward, first in the Word. Remember, Paul said, it's not that I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. And he's first speaking of spiritual fruit, eyes of your understanding enlightened, fruit of the Spirit energized, fruits of righteousness like Philippians 1 promises. Then, of course, the great physical abundance of your need being supplied, whereby you can rebuke the devourer. And that's just with the tithe, the 10%. But there is a great difference between manipulated, being put to sleep, and just going through the motions of sending your bread in, mainly out of fear perhaps, or out of legalistic routine. Sometimes people faithfully give because they're terrified that if they quit, the roof's going to cave in on them. Well, it may, but that can't be your primary motivation. Our primary motivation is that we love God and we want to keep His commandments, and that you love the minister for giving you the truth. Yes, it is healthy to be aware of consequences. That has to be in the blend of our comprehension. But you see how the false teachers turn it on its ear, distort it. It's a subtle, if not adamant, preaching of consequences. If you stop giving, everybody's going to get sick, you're going to go broke, you're going to, if that's the primary motive. And it takes an honest person to recognize this, and of course most of them aren't because consciences are so seared with a hot iron. But it takes an honest person to realize, am I mainly giving because I'm terrified that the devourer is going to eat my lunch? Nothing wrong with being aware that that is a possibility. It's a blend of thought. That's only mature. Come on. But the greatest has to be the love in your heart. Remember when Moses asked for abundance of resources to build the tabernacle? People gave of their own free will thankfulness for being delivered out of Egypt. They gave so much that the priest said to Moses, tell them to stop. We've got more than we need. Now that's abundant sharing. Paul says of the Macedonians when he's confronting the Corinthians again in 2 Corinthians 8, that they were more willing of themselves to give than even we needed to receive. Now that's a mind on fire for the truth. See, all these things are part of your motivation. Yes, you give because first you love God and you want to please Him, and you're thankful to God for the Word you're being taught. And Galatians 6:6 says, share. It says, let him that is taught in the Word King James says communicate, but it means share fully with him that teacheth. So you make up your mind who's teaching you the word, and you want your heart so on fire that you want to share of your abundance. Yes, that's the other next section of the motive. Sure, you're aware that you will be given blessings that you can claim. Absolutely, you should be aware of that. Again, Paul says, and that's certainly always been my mind through all these decades of ministering, not that I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. That's my main motive. But motivations are a recipe of proper thought. Please God, keep his commandments. Share abundantly with the one that you love for teaching you the word. Knowing that the tithe is an immutable law. It's not of the legalism side. It was Abraham, before the law was given, gave a tithe of the abundance to the priest of the Most High God, Melchizedek. That set tithing as an immutable, all-encompassing standard. You know, you've heard people say over the years, well, tithing's of the law, so I don't do it. Yeah, right. That's backwards logic. Well, if you don't do tithing and it's of the law, and if you're of grace, then you ought to be doing more than tithing. But no, they've already argued themselves out of it, thinking they're really being a grace believer by not doing nothing. Come on, give me a break. You can't do that. Tithe, the first occurrence of the tithe is Abram in Genesis 14. Don't try to pull my leg. Patriarchal administration before the law. Yes, tithing was part of the law, but it was established previous to it in the patriarchal administration before the Mosaic law. That tells me and you that have eyes to see and ears to hear that tithing is a immutable, which means all-time, all-encompassing standard of pleasing God and living a life which is more than abundant. And keep reminding yourself of what Dr. Wimble wrote in Christians Should Be Prosperous, that 9/10 with God's blessing goes much further than 10/10 without it. And you have to be spiritually oriented to believe that, because the natural world will scoff at such logic. Of course they will, because it's greed and selfishness, and yet in their own businesses they know they have to spend money to make money. So while they scoff, they do the same thing in one way or another. But it's always the mindset of an authentic man of God. Not that I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. Ask yourself, what good did Abraham's tithe do to Melchizedek? Dr. Rill showed us years ago that Melchizedek had to be an angel, because it says later in Hebrews he has no, without father, without mother, no beginning. He had to be a spirit being, sent representing the true God. A Levite could not be sent because of the contamination of the human blood in the Levitical side. Jesus Christ was the high priest of Israel, not from the Levitical point of view, because he could only be of one bloodline, and that's Judea. So God created a priest line to supersede the Levitical so that Abram could give his tithe and establish the immutability of it, and later Jesus Christ is a priest forever after the order of guess who? Not Levi, Melchizedek. A lot going on there, folks. A lot of truth going on there. That's God. He can do what the hell he wants. He doesn't violate his word. Creates a priest line, and Melchizedek is noted for two things: that Jesus Christ is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, and that he was the recipient of the first tithe given. I'd call that pretty big endorsements to tithing. Right up there with Jesus Christ, wouldn't you? So, here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God. That's where they really turn you into a fool. When you have shared of your resources to encourage their falsity, if to encourage their devouring you. One of the text reads, I'm still basically working out of 2 Corinthians 11, 19, and 20, if it matters. I'm telling you the truth. Or what scripture I'm expounding on. But Amplified says they make slaves of you. If a man devour you, if they are devourers of your substance. One of the texts says, if a man take of you and praise, P-R-E-Y, upon you. Yes. You know, that's one of the 17 cities of Moab that I expound upon. One of the aggregates of the old nature. If you don't renounce it, so that you can renew above it to mortify it, one of the aggregates of the old nature is to be made a prey, P-R-E-Y, to turn yourself into a victim. And you're victimized by the spirit realm and by these fools, these false ministers. So you renounce that tendency. And if you recognize it in yourself, you renounce it deep and go to the Word and renew above it. I'm nobody's prey, P-R-E-Y. I'm nobody's sacrificial heifer. Well, that 2 Corinthians 11 speaks loudly, which I expand upon even further in my paper, which I think you'll benefit from. And we are expanding upon, let me finish this and then we'll take a break, the great Amplified of 2 Timothy 4, 3, and 4. For the time is coming when people will not tolerate or endure sound and wholesome instruction. And that time is now. I just added that. But having ears itching for something pleasing and gratifying, they will gather to themselves one teacher after another, to a considerable number, chosen to satisfy their own liking and to foster the errors they hold, and will turn aside from hearing the truth and wander off into myths and man-made fictions. That's what we're working to avoid. All right, let's take 10. Thinking of the great revelation in Isaiah where Father says, come, let us reason together. I love that. Isn't that what we are doing when we go to the Word with a proper mindset of love and believing? We are reasoning together with the Creator of the heavens and the earth, with the Spirit connection, the DNA of Jesus Christ, connecting us to the God and Father and Creator, that we are reasoning together with Him as we search these scriptures. I often think of 1 Corinthians 12 coming right on the heels of the enumeration of the manifestations and this tremendous admonition of verse 11. I love very much. But all these, referring to the previous detailing of spiritual matters, and especially referring to the 9 manifestations of verses 8, 9, and 10. But all these worketh or are energized by that one and the self-same Spirit. Dr. Wierwille called that a triple reflexive. And Spirit is usage one, God the giver. Dividing or distributing to every man, and of course that refers to each believer, severally, idios, his own, each believer, his or her own, as, according as he or she, the believer, will. And the word will is boulomai, which means mature deliberation and careful consideration, careful and diligent determination. So this is how we come to the Word as the Word of life. Even when we're just enjoying the reading of it, we read it with attention and believing, and this wonderful attitude of respect for the author as we come to reason together. Well, that amplified rendering of 2 Timothy 4:3 and 4 certainly led to some tremendous truth. I'd like to read the Lamsa Bible of this fourth step downward. For the time will come when men will not listen to sound doctrine. You see, that's intriguing. They'll find every excuse they can think of not to go to the Word, not to carefully consider the truth. And usually it's always the justifiable problems of their families and their jobs and their health. This all makes appropriate excuses, appropriate rationale for ignoring the Word in your private study. Well, obviously, those don't have to be distractions. We've all dealt with those things over the years. And yet we still can learn to make that time, like you're doing now, to think this Word through with me, and then privately in your own personal study. I was reminded again yesterday in response to a text of the great Acts 17:11. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the Word with all readiness of mind and searched the Scriptures daily, whether those things were so. That's one of the great defining truths of what I would term the remnant, the archipelago of grace, the archipelago of light, that we search these Scriptures daily. That's a priority. Whether those things are true was not meant that they searched for errors, but it meant that they made it their own, what the great apostle Paul and others like Barnabas and Silas and Timothy, what they had been teaching, Titus, that they worked it from a believing point of view to get convincingly convinced. Because remember, without believing, it's impossible to please Him. And believing, among other things, is to be fully persuaded. So what does it take for you to get fully persuaded? Well, a couple of weeks ago, it took me recognizing Scriptures as I rode my bike. And that's what gave me the impetus to move ahead with teaching what I knew to be the truth. Can be any number of scenarios. He's a personal God, and He will give you places to walk, it says in Zephaniah. He will open doors of utterance, and He will give you places and scenarios in which you can prioritize the working of this word to and within yourself, to have the joy then of living it, experiencing it, sharing it with others as doors of utterance open. For the time will come when men will not listen to sound doctrine, but they will add for themselves extra teachers according to their desires, being lured by enticing words. Boy, is that vivid. Lured by enticing words. Well, these teachers are capable. Many of them are quite brilliant. I concede to that. They can quote scripture, they can tie in illustrations, they have wonderful oratorical skills, then they bring in all their fancy music and productions and light shows, and yet when you really boil it down, they're wrongly dividing the word. You see, adding to themselves extra teachers betrays their motive. They have been confronted by the sound doctrine of the grace administration, and yet not willing to raise themselves up to that standard. They can always find plenty of others blabbing doctrines that agree with their old nature impulses, the old nature selfishness, the old nature idolatry that is festered and formed in those hidden things, unrenounced, unrevoked. So they're out there in droves. The spirit realm will provide them, and they add to themselves. This is why it's very important that you make this your own, that you're convinced within yourself by your own private and personal time in the Word that this truth is genuine and authentic. And then it goes on to say, and they will turn away their ears from the truth, and they will turn to fables. That's Lamsa. Now, sometimes when you read these versions, you just have reiteration, but then you run across great unique phrasing, like we just read, being lured by enticing words. It's like a man I heard say years ago, you know, the bait is delectable, and it smells good, and it looks good, and appeals to your senses, but the only problem is there's a hook in it. Heard a guy speaking about communism that used that illustration. Well, boy, is that true with doctrinal error and with the false words of false teachers. They can be made to look so appealing, but there's a hook in it. And the hook is the spirit behind it, and spirits that people open themselves to, the wicked spirits from on high that hide behind the good words and fair speeches. Now, the next rendering is from the 1881 Revised Version. This is the one that Dr. Wierwille told us many consider the greatest of all the translations. And Dr. Bullinger had either a great-great-grandfather or a uncle or something that worked on this translation, where it reads, "For the time will come when they will not endure the sound doctrine, but, having itching ears, will heap to themselves teachers after their own lusts, and will turn away their ears from the truth, and turn aside unto fables." So you see, not a lot different from the King James, but it's still good to check these. The reiteration is always valuable. Then from this great book Dr. Wierwille made us aware of many times, The Life and Epistles of St. Paul, by these two British ministers, gentlemen, Conybeare and Housen. You've perhaps heard me refer to. They have some unique renderings in their great book. Conybeare and Housen, for a time will come when they will not endure the sound doctrine, but according to their own inclinations, wow, they will heap up for themselves teachers upon teachers to please their itching ears, and they will turn away their ears from the truth and turn aside to fables. Now there's some wonderful, unique language. Their own inclinations. Again, this gets right back to unrenounced, hidden things. That's where it starts. But then it festers and foments false thinking. And to avoid this, we must do what 2 Corinthians 4:2 says. And I'd also like you to remind yourself of 2 Corinthians 7 here. You know, in Romans, the doctrine, he says, mortify the deeds of the body. There's the doctrine, which I believe is a reference to speaking in tongues and the old nature. Corinthians, the reproof based on that doctrine, and that mortifies in Romans 11:13. The reproof based on that doctrine is renounce hidden things of dishonesty. See, essentially the same truth, but in different words to correct practical error from chapter 4, verse 2. And also here, chapter 7, verse 1. Having therefore these promises, dearly beloved, watch this, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit. Boy, is that vivid. Perfecting holiness in the respect of God. Boy, there's some unique phrasing. We have these promises, therefore. What are you going to do with them? Well, if you're not going to cleanse yourself from all filthiness of the old nature, the spiritual flesh, these promises go null and void. That's what that says. That's what that means. That's why to heap to themselves teacher after teacher just gives them excuse to ignore such admonitions. This is why you can listen to every teacher in the world, and yet no teacher can do this for you. And of course, most of those teachers won't encourage you to do that for yourself. They will come up with all kinds of senseless faith excuses for ignoring the great manifestations of power from on high. All kinds of mental gymnastics and doctrinal calligraphy to distract from the essence of the word, which is that every truth must fit in the framework of the manifestations. No teacher can do this for you. Only I can do this for myself. Cleanse ourselves. That's renouncing hidden things. That's mortifying the deeds of the body. So there you've got it in doctrine. You've got it in reproof. And here you got it in correction, Galatians 5. And how appropriate that it comes right after the great handling of the works of the flesh, of which there are 17, lining up with the 17 aggregates of Moab, of Isaiah 15. And then it leads into the great fruit of the Spirit, which replaces those renounced and revoked hidden things. And then a grand summation in verse 24 of Galatians 5. And they that are Christ's have crucified the flesh with the affections and lusts. How do you do that? If we live in or by the Spirit gift, lowercase, let us walk also by or in the Spirit in manifestation. Right there's your correction of the great ability of speaking in tongues. How do you crucify the old nature? Something that vividly adamant and godly in destruction without the Holy Spirit energy of speaking in tongues to do the crucifying. You crucify the old nature with the affections, passions, and lust. So there you've got Romans 8:13 to 2 Corinthians 4:1 and 4:2 and 7:1 to Galatians 5:24, all referring to this great prowess capability to renounce hidden things by speaking in tongues. And they heap to themselves teacher upon teacher because they do not want to renounce those inclinations. And teacher upon teacher gives distraction, so one can more easily ignore such revelation and continue to fester and live within the boiling fermentation of old nature lust. And they will turn away their ears from the truth. Sure, that will lead to that. They won't want to even hear it. And turn aside to fables. They'd much rather read the Greek myths and fables. I noticed that. I'm reading a book by a guy that was an avowed atheist all his life. I'm reading his autobiography. And he was a brilliant man, and he wrote political essays and book criticisms and things, and I enjoyed his mind and his vocabulary, but of course, that part of it I was aware of. And yet all these guys that are so proud of their atheism, how many times in their literature do they refer to Greek gods and Greek goddesses and Egyptian gods and goddesses as illustrations? It seems to be the accepted intellectual snootiness of the literary world that they will deny biblical truth. They deny the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ and do so adamantly and cynically. And yet they they talk all the time about, Jove and Epaphroditus and Hermes and Mercury and Cerberus, the three-headed dog, and they all love Dante's Inferno, which is just sheer paganism. Especially Roman Catholics love Dante's Inferno. That documents all their doctrinal error about heaven and hell and death and all that jive. They're just so contradictory. They have learned to be comfortable with their conundrums. They have learned to be comfortable with their enigmas. They have learned to be comfortable with the contradictions that they allow in their two-faced brains. Well, we don't do that. We renounce the hidden inclinations so we can renew up to set our affections on things above. And the rest of them wallow with all their counterfeit gods, all infused of devil spirits. Every idol has an associated devil spirit, Dr. World taught us. Whether it's in the physical realm or whether it's just in a mental paradigm, whether it's in emotional states where people worship certain emotions, and that rules all in their logic, their spirit moving that. Now, I also have in my paper here renderings from the Greek interlinear, and sometimes you can get a nice twist of a phrase, turn of a phrase here that's very valuable. And of course, even the Greek word, the more you're familiar with, can help. So it says, for there will be a time. Time is kairos. That's a great word referring to a particular season, a spiritual season. For there will be a time, and of course this is a dark spiritual season of estrangement and betrayal and treason. For there will be a time when sound teaching they will not bear. But, and the word but here is stark contrast. It's the Greek word Allah. There's another word but that's simply just a small, it still is a contrast, but it's not as adamant. But this one's quite adamant. But instead of enduring and bearing the sound teaching, according to their own desires, to themselves will heap up teachers. See, I love that. And desires is that word for passion. But according to, that's their standard. What is your according to? What is your standard? Their standard is the passions of the old nature. And everything that the world encourages and promotes is always according to old nature, lust, and desire. And the world has just made life all to revolve around what they call the subconscious or the unconscious. And I've said this before, but what the world encourages you to investigate and give into and open yourself up to, which they call your creative self, is what the Word tells you to cleanse yourself of, because it's filthiness of flesh and spirit. Just the opposite. The Word tells you to renounce it, revoke it, if you want that new nature to have regnancy and to prevail. So they heap to themselves. They heap up. Heap up. See that in the Greek. Wow. Pile them on. You pile on so many blabbing, gum-bumping, palaver maestros, you don't even take the time to think about what God would say. You can turn on the television, go on the worldwide, Googled up, Internet Goofy, and just fill your mind with baloney hours on end. Keeps you from having to consider that you're no longer enduring sound doctrine. Find that teacher that best agrees with your theology, as Dr. Earl put it once. Well, we want the Word to be our standard, don't we? So they pile them up, teachers, because their ears are itchy. And from the truth, the Greek preposition, apo, indicating the source, from, they move away from the truth. They turn their ear from the truth, and then they turn away unto fables, muthos, M-U-T-H-O-U-S. They turn aside unto those fables. You see, in Dr. Earl's literals, an intriguing phrase, as we've read before, but let's look at it here. He reads, there will be a time when they will not tolerate the sound doctrine, but according to their own lustful desires, they with itching ears will pile up various teachers for themselves. They run to this false minister, that false minister. They run to this self-help, self-proclaimed genius of life. Oh man, you can find them on PBS, you can find them on network, you can find them on cable, you can find them on the internet. What do they call life coaches? You talk about the height of arrogance. And from what I see, it's usually women that call themselves life coaches. They don't know God from a knock upside the head. They don't know the integrity and accuracy of the Word from Immanuel Kant or Wittgenstein or Nietzsche. They don't know dip from dumb. They don't know dung from doo-doo. And they call themselves life coaches. They're loaded with devils. They got ruling spirits running through their minds. Wasn't that years ago that Hillary Clinton was going to a life coach, spiritualist, took her into seances and had her talking to the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt? Of course, when it came out, they backed up like crazy. Oh, it's just a mental exercise. No, it's devil possession. Talking to the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt, what the hell you want to do that for? Unless you agree with her life. She was a hardcore lesbian. Great admired woman. Well, admire her. I don't. I'd rather admire Deborah and Esther and you remnant ladies. Eleanor Roosevelt. Good God Almighty. Pick you a better hero than that, can't you? Yeah, she was talking to the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, it's a devil spirit, because Eleanor Roosevelt's dead as a doggone doornail. She's dead as yesterday's camel dung. She's been rotting in the grave for decades, because the dead are not alive. If you believe the dead are alive, well, then you got all these spirits of these idiots running around. These are devil spirits that imitate, that knew these people, and in her case, that worked in and through her. They're still around. They're looking for homes. Hillary Clinton would be a good one, wouldn't she? Brother, they are ignorant of spiritual matters. Well, we don't want to be ignorant of spiritual matters. But I guess that's what it takes to get rich and famous. You got to be a spiritual dodo, so the spirit realm will elevate you with your dubious abilities to the top of some aspect of the subculture and zeitgeist and get you wealthy and famous, and that's what they contend is the height of life. Well, not for us. They pile up teachers. And here's Dr. Wervel's great line. They will turn their ears away from the truth and will be jerked aside to myths. I love that. They're jerked aside. They're jerked unto being jerks, that's for sure. Somebody told a joke once, what's the definition of a fisherman? Somebody with a jerk on each end of the pole or something. But they're lured. They'll be jerked aside to myths. No offense to you fishermen, it was just a joke. But Dr. Earl's great line, jerked aside. He loved to fish, so he probably got a chuckle out of picking that as part of his literal translation according to usage. Wow. I added a note on my paper here, by devil energies. That's the jerking, by devil energies. Then I also worked quite in detail. Wears me out to read this. I wrote out every one of the companion Bible's notations on each of these 4 steps downward. Man, oh man. Where did I get all this energy? Well, I think I know where, but I'm glad I don't have to do it again. So I wrote out every one of Dr. Bullinger's great notes. And so let's go through a few of these. I understand this can be tedious at times, but it's helpful. Hold your attention the best you can, and when you see yourself drifting away, you take a break, get on your 2-wheeled sports car, or whatever you do, go fishing, then come back to it. But let me track through a little bit of this if you don't mind. We've got it. I'm looking at my clock correctly here, yeah. Let's take a few minutes on. I just wanted to show you the background of how I've worked this thing. And this is the paper we can get out to you for your further investigation. And some of you already have this. You might have forgotten about it like I did. I'm the guy that wrote it. I forgot I had it. And yet I think it was of godly design because, as I've told you, as I worked back through the early pages, I realized I've taught, for the most part, all the major points I wrote. There's just a lot of background and detail that is valuable if you want to go back through it. So clearly writing all this, little did I know, was great preparation for what we've been doing the last few months. But 2 Timothy 4, 3 and 4, for the time, season, this is from the Companion Bible, will come, will be, when they will not. Now he does quite an expansion on this word not. Love it. It's very adamant. They will not, expressing full and direct negation, independently and absolutely. In other words, emphasizing the free will choice to allow themselves to be so spiritually influenced to their detriment that they will not endure sound doctrine. See how you work this stuff through? He goes on to say, not depending on any condition expressed or implied. Well, I'm not sure I get that, because it seems like the condition is all the previous steps downward. So see, I don't have to accept that angle, because I think that's contradictory. It may apply in other places this Greek word is used. But certainly the point made, expressing full and direct negation, independently and absolutely, in other words, free will choice of each of them, not to endure sound. Now the word sound has got quite a pedigree behind it. He refers to 1 Timothy 1:10 in its occurrence, and then he gives several illustrations that it's used in health. This is the medical word, hugiano, for being sound in your physical health. And he gives several examples here, which I had looked them all up previously. Paul uses it in a moral sense, okay, soundness of ethics, soundness of moral, of course, based on the truth of the word. Then he goes to the word doctrine here. It's the Greek word didaskaleia, same word in 1 Timothy 4:6. And this is a word that occurs in a number of places in the word. But after, now here's your standard, according to kata, K-A-T-A, governs two cases, the genitive and the accusative, and denotes two motions, vertical and horizontal. With the accusative, which is our situation here, it denotes horizontal motion along which the action proceeds. It's like that's your pathway. It's their pathway, their mind path, their groove of the brain. Their pathway is their own lusts. So you have to stop and check the context again. You can get so wrapped up into one word, I can forget what it's referring to. So I take back up a little bit. That horizontal pathway along which their actions proceed, which is to what? Not endure sound doctrine, is their own lusts. See? Unrenounced, unrevoked. Those impulses that shape their thinking, along which the action proceeds. Remember, he said in Jeremiah that they have an idol on every street. That word that illustration from Jeremiah 11:13, if I'm recalling correctly, not only was a physical reality of the times, but it was also an amplified metaphor that if they had eyes to see and ears to hear, showed them their minds, their own minds, the thought processes, the pathways, that they had allowed every logical, as they would call it, reasoning action of will to result in idolatry. Now that's having a mind scorched. So no matter what angle of logic they approached it, they would always end up with something in the creation that they worship above the Creator. So that's the kata, along which the action proceeds. Sometimes it includes the purpose or intention, absolutely. The destination to be reached, see how that ties to Jeremiah 11? See, this is what I do in my own mind when I work. Some of this may not transliterate in an electrifying teaching, but I'm just trying to reason it through with you, show you how I work this. The destination to be reached, well, the destination determined by their decision, independently arrived at, not to endure sound doctrine. The destination is that idol on that pathway, that street, that lane, that alley, shaped by unrenounced evil that they heap up to themselves. That's pretty darn good. It has regard to the duration of the motion. Think of that, duration. In other words, they have spent whatever time necessary to reach the adamant, independently arrived at conclusion. They have taken whatever time it took within their own mind, between their own ears, to decide not to endure sound doctrine, but instead to ignore their real spiritual need and heap to themselves teachers having itchy ears. Well, let's stop there so I don't drive you too crazy with all that detail. But bless your hearts. What a joy. As you work these details, you reach these grand conclusions personally for yourself, that you will stand and withstand in a day and time and hour in which we live, that you will not succumb to the false teachers, and that you refuse to forsake or reject the grace of God in our administration and time. All right. God bless you. See you next week.